So a few months ago, my team detected the activity of the Kadar's malware. And you may be familiar with Kadar's. It's an evolution of Zeus. It's an info stealer. It's a really cool piece of malware because what it does is it compromises the victim's computer. And once it compromises it, it waits till you go to Facebook and then does a web inject on Facebook and invites you to download an app that complements the Trojan. And the app is installed on your Android phone, and it gives you instructions for overriding the security warnings of that. And then what it does is it intercepts the two-factor authentication used by banks so that it can log in as you and steal your money. So my team conducts security monitoring for customers, and we saw this a few months ago for one of our large Canadian financials. This malware, by the way, it specifically targets banks in specific regions. So the Netherlands, India, Canada is one of them, and we happen to have a customer in Canada who's a large financial. So we gave this a lot of scrutiny. And when we looked at it, we saw that within just a few minutes, this was something of alarm to us. So when we investigated it, these are the steps we went through. This is what an investigator, and some of you may be security investigators. These are what our security investigators do. As soon as our analyst saw this attack, she raised this to an investigator for deeper investigation. The investigator made sure we saw a callback. And Netflow is a key tool that we use. We love Netflow because we don't have to worry about the payload. We can see the traffic moving around. And you can see the callback at 1-minute intervals, which if you're a security investigator, you know that's typical bot activity. So we see botnet activity coming. We also see that the IOC is matching, meaning this IP address for some period of time is considered malicious. And the attacker was smart enough to actually Trojan a machine at St. Mary's University in Canada, which would then lower the defenses of anyone monitoring that network. And we found that this was targeted in the sense that we didn't see any of our other customers being hit by the same malware. So I'm a manager. I'm not a hacker. And I want to tell you in just a few minutes why I'm really here, why I'm in Krakow, but I'm going to wait till the end. And what I want to walk you through today are just the way we see the world. We run a group. I actually came from, I was an investigator for years. I started a security monitoring team. I wrote a work based on that, based on what I've learned doing security monitoring just for inside of Cisco. And then we turned that into a service to offer it to customers. And the reason we did that is we can see that the world is changing and that customers need something better. The threats are changing. For example, everyone brings their own device to work now in most companies. They can show up with their own Android phone, iPhone, iPad, their own custom-built Windows laptop or Mac, like my Mac. People are using social media all day. And we know that attackers are leveraging social media to enable them to stalk their prey and to ultimately succeed to convince them to install that malware. We also know that there's a ton of cloud services, which makes it really hard to know what is malicious network traffic and what's benign. And the app stores, some app stores are better at curating their content than others. We also know that threats are changing. So for example, does anyone here read the Verizon data breach investigation report? Now, Verizon's kind of a competitor for me, but I love that report. That report is full of great information about how attacks are working and which ones are not working. And one of the things that they highlight is that the attacker is usually successful within just a few hours. 60% of the time, it only takes minutes or hours for the attack to succeed and begin exfiltrating information. But most defenders, it takes them months. And usually that means law enforcement taps them on the shoulder or a CERT organization and says, we've found evidence that your system is compromised. We know also that point-of-sale malware, which is something, at least in the US, that's been hitting us hard. Target, Home Depot have been hit very hard by point-of-sale malware, is extraordinarily successful. And companies are losing millions of US dollars. Now, in my years of experience, and I've been in security now for 13 years, so I've been at this for a while. Back in the 2000s, sort of the good old days, attackers were mostly there to annoy you, right? Trojans were disruptive. They created a lot of network noise, fairly easy to see on the network. But if you remember things like Code Red and Slammer, really disruptive. They would just blast through your network. But in the mid-2000s, the attackers got really good, and they found a way to make money at this. And an entire ecosystem was developed that allowed them to trade Trojans and skills for money. And we now find ourselves in a place where attacks are migrating not just to make money. Cybercrime is real, and it's a large part of what we see. But we also see that attackers are going after corporate data. And I'll show you an example in just a few minutes of one of the attacks that we've observed that we know was purposely trying to steal corporate data from a customer. So we know that corporate data is on the menu for attackers, and they're getting better and better. But all this time, our ability to see through this and find data loss is getting harder and harder. Why? In the old days, IRC was just, that's how C2 happened. It was just IRC. All you had to do was block IRC ports, and you were relatively safe. And then they tunneled it, and then they encrypted it, and now they use social media and cloud storage to move stuff around, and we now see attacks using Pinterest and YouTube comments for C2. So that's encrypted traffic, and how do you know that it's malicious if someone's going to Pinterest and YouTube versus some crazy-looking DGA? It gets getting harder and harder for the defender. So the group that I run is called Cisco Active Threat Analytics, ATA. I had a guy design a logo for us, and I like it because it's a bunch of binary, and we can find attacks sitting there in the middle. And what we really aim to do is to use 4 things to solve the problem. If we start with people, we hire great people. We hire investigators that have at least 10 years of experience doing security investigations. They know their stuff. Because you can't just point tools at this problem and win. You got to have good people. Second, we apply analytics. And the reason we apply analytics is because of what I just said on the last slide. We're getting blind. The payloads are encrypted. The attackers are using social media to move data around. You've got to have analytics to spot the malicious from the benign. We use security intelligence. Security intelligence is probably 80% of the wins we get today is through intelligence. Just very quickly being able to see data and zoom in on it. And then lastly, we've built a new platform called OpenSOC. And I'm going to show it to you in just a few minutes. OpenSOC allows us to apply big data, which you hear way too many times. You're sick of hearing the term, I know. But we use Hadoop and a bunch of Apache projects to handle massive amounts of data, 6 gig per second or more, and actually find attacks in the data. So these are the 4 pillars of our solution. And in just a couple minutes, I'm going to go through and kind of talk to you about how this works for us. Now, one of the things we heard from customers is that they don't want their data to leave their network. So we put this big stack of gear, and it's all Cisco stuff, but it's running open source software, plus our own. We own SourceFire now, the Snort guys. We own that. We put it in there. Threat Grid, a sandbox, we put that in there too. We put it on a customer network, and we don't move data in or out. Now, big surprise, customers in Europe are not interested in having their data leave their data center and come back through the US. Why? Because of what they've learned from Edward Snowden. So customers want their data sitting on their data center. They also want staff from at least in or near their country to be analyzing it, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But we use a secure VPN link to analyze the data, and then we have tools that allow us to move it around within our case systems, and then ultimately brief a customer securely about the attack. Now, one of the cool things about this solution is that not only are we snarfing all the data off the wire, but we're also indexing it all. So we build network metadata on top of that, which means we get full packet capture plus metadata indexing across all of the payload, right? Because as you know, the headers of those IP packets are super interesting. But we also take machine exhaust, which means we take your syslog, we'll log into databases and scoop the data out. We know how to pull data from anywhere in the network and stuff it in this big system and analyze it and find threats. And that's what we're doing. Now, OpenSOC in particular, which runs on this platform, there's two key things it does. The first is that it enriches the data. And that means if you're an analyst and your job is to make the donuts every day, which means you're there monitoring the network, looking for threats, we enrich the data with what we know about the victim. Where did this happen on the victim's network? What IP address range? Because there's a big difference between the guest wireless and the data center where the Oracle server is. Huge difference, right? So we mark up the data, we enrich it, we add data about vulnerabilities of the victim, what we know about intelligence of the attacker itself. And then the second thing we do is we apply analytics to it. We conduct predictive modeling. We've actually partnered with a company that does banking fraud, and we've taken those algorithms and we've applied them into this. So we can discover new DGAs. We can discover new means of exfiltration that no one has seen before by applying it right there onto our platform. This platform, if we zoom into it, here's what it looks like. And after the talk, if you want to go into detail about how this works, talk to Gavel, because he's the technical guy. I'm not technical enough to give you a fully detailed breakdown, but I can get you in touch with the people that can. Here's how it works. The first thing we do is up at the top left, we just put in a passive tap. So this solution is passive. If it breaks, we're not going to bring down the network. We pull in everything we can off the network, not only by snarfing data off the wire, but also any of the network telemetry or machine exhaust on there. And effectively, if you look at these Apache projects like Flume and Kafka and Storm, these are just Apache projects. They're tools that allow us to handle massive amounts of data, set up topics to prioritize how we process the data, and move it through the system. So it's real-time processing. Storage, we actually use Hive for storage. So that means when we find an attack, we can index the packet associated to that attack, go back and find it and analyze it. So the investigator actually has a recording of the full packet capture when he goes to analyze the attack. Huge, huge advantage to his analysis. You can go to GitHub and get it yourself. And now, we're not going to help you with Hadoop. We're not going to bring investigative skills. We won't give you our playbook. But you can use that platform yourself and run it on big iron, big hardware, and can do this kind of thing on your own by downloading GitHub. Or excuse me, by downloading OpenSOC. You don't have enough room to download GitHub. Now, the intelligence, sort of the secret sauce inside of this system, is because Cisco is in a really privileged position in the world. We are on most of the world's network. And that means we can see things that no one else can see. For example, we see a third of the world's email traffic because it traverses our hardware, our routers, switches, email security appliances. We actually see all that traffic. And if you add up all the web requests we see with our cloud security, with the WSA, the web security appliance, as well as our cloud solutions for web security, we see 13 billion web requests every day. So we put all that in the system, in addition to the connections we have with the DNS routes, the ISP gateways, government intelligence, open source intelligence. And you put all that together, we have a superior position. We have information superiority. That means we can spot threats in a massive system that others can't see. And so we use that responsibly by deploying that not only into our products and platforms, but also into our services so we can help customers with this. You can't really buy this intelligence. You have to buy it through our services and products. So the last thing I'd like to highlight about the solution, and then I'm going to give you a couple of case studies, what I call exemplars. This map is the DGA for CryptoLocker. So DGA, most of you probably know, but just bear with me, a domain-generated algorithm, which means that attackers are smart enough now that they don't bother using just an IP address for command and control because you'll stomp on it. Then they used fast flux to register a DNS against tons of IPs, and then you had to block the DNS name. Now they're smart enough that they register a DGA in the malware with an algorithm that allows them to switch up the DNS that they're connected to over and again so fast that you can never block the actual attacks anymore. And so we have to get smarter. One of the ways we get smarter is by discovering the DGA. We can then use that to prioritize our detection and some of our prevention by blocking it. So we use predictive analytics. We use what we've learned from the cognitive acquisition in Prague to apply data scientists on all this data and find the attacks. That's one of the advantages we bring to the solution. So my favorite thing to talk about are the real cases, the things we've seen. So that's what we'll do. Before I go into them, though, I'll just tell you, over the past few months that I've been on this team, here's some of the things we've seen that I think are indicative of where the market is going for attacks. And I wonder if these resonate with you. If they do, maybe let's grab a coffee or a beer and we can talk about them. But here's what I think we're seeing. Over the past 10 years, in fact, my executives come to me, the VP comes to me and says, hey, tell me what kinds of attacks we're seeing so I can brief this to customers. And he says, how are attacks changing? And I said, well, the attacks really haven't changed that much in the last 10 years. It's still the users who are the victims and they're getting breached. Malware is really still where most of the attacks occur, most of the time. But what's changed is in the old days, it used to be your operating system that was vulnerable and compromised. And these days, it's plugins, Flash, Java, Silverlight. That's how the attacks are typically succeeding today. We're also seeing malware is, sandboxes became a big thing about 3 or 4 years ago. Malware is getting smarter. It knows how to evade. It knows how to detect that it's in a sandbox and then just evade it. We're also seeing Tor, which used to be used for privacy protection. Tor is now being used for malware exfiltration and command and control. We're seeing that more and more used more commonly. We're seeing Zeus is kind of on the outs. Drydex is taking its place. So Zeus is on its way out, or maybe it's on its way out, but they're not making the money they used to. We're seeing attackers getting better at obfuscation, the way they name files and move things around. Zeus kind of began that because the attacker was smart enough he could hide the malware in the user profile instead of the system32. But attackers are getting smarter at the way they name things and move things around and hide them and name processes, and that they're just, obfuscation is getting really clever. And then lastly, has anyone been in security long enough to remember macros as a way of delivering an exploit? Like exploiting someone via an Office macro? That is so old school, but it's happening again. That's the way attacks are getting through again, because every user will say yes to enable macros. And the attackers are just changing the stages of the attack so that it reaches out to pastebin and gets some code and then goes out to Dropbox to get the real code, and it's all happening all over again. So attackers are smart enough to keep us on our toes. Now remember, most attacks follow a kill chain. At least typical malware attacks follow a kill chain. The first thing you do is you figure out who you want to attack via social media, right? So I know I want to get into Cisco. So let me see if I can find the Windows domain administrators. And I'll do that by looking for people in an IT role at Cisco on LinkedIn. Right? Pretty common. They then lure them with some kind of a bait like a resume. Hey, can you look this over? Or an invitation to something. And it all follows. Most of you, or probably all of you, know the kill chain. But the goal is that we want to help, as a defender, we want to move to the left side of this in our detection, right? I was just talking to someone who has a company that's there to monitor social media and cloud storage to find indications of attack, to help customers find those attacks earlier in the kill chain. They would find them, say, at the recon level. That's the goal. As defenders, we need to move ourselves to the left. So let me give you a couple examples. Here's our first example, case 1011 from my team. And this was some sandbox evading malware that was targeted at corporate users. So let's walk through the attack and the way the attack works. This was the Chanator malware. Now, first of all, the attackers were smart enough to compromise WordPress servers to host the exploit. Now, why is that important? It's important because it lowers your defenses when you see a name that doesn't look like a DGA, so that you click on it and install the software from it. So the attackers exploited WordPress. Then they phished corporate users with this really well-written volume license email, asking you to register your Microsoft volume license agreement. The user clicked it. They were redirected to a clever site that hid the malware using some nice, really well-written JavaScript. The Trojan was executed. It actually hid itself. It did some clever things. Then it reached out to figure out its own IP address of the victim, then tested its connection. Hey, smart enough to see if the connection to the C2 server will succeed, and then once it succeeded, it actually began exfiltration. So let's look at how this went down. The first thing is that the victim of this attack received an email. And we've all received phishing emails, and they're terrible. They're so obvious. You see it, and you're like, why would anyone fall for this thing? It is so obviously a phish, right? But this one was really good. If you read this email, there's a couple of things you're going to notice. First of all, the English is perfect. Second of all, it's about your volume license agreement with Microsoft. That means it's targeted to corporate users. Third, the user ID is both in the from or in the to. It's also in the link itself. So, it actually looks really legit. I mean, I think I might have fallen for this one. So the user clicks the link. And when the user clicks the link, here's what happens. They go to the Microsoft site, and the SSL certificate matches. Okay, so it matches. There are no warnings or anything. But through a trick of JavaScript and the way they framed this, you actually get a download, and the download comes from this site called laterally.com. So that's the compromised WordPress server. Okay, so the user gets this download, and it's a zip file. All users open zip files, and they execute the code. They always do it, and this user did. And so here's how we saw it. Our security analysts, the first thing they saw was an alert, and the alert was a really cool feature called retrospection, which means we saw this file, which actually hosted the attack, on a PHP page. And when we saw that connection out to the PHP page, at first, when we saw it, it looked fine. It was benign. But we later got intelligence that was fed into the system that said, hey, you know what? Something I saw happen 6 hours ago, I now know is malicious, so you should probably take a look at it. So the analyst saw this alert and began to dig into the attack. So the first thing the analyst did was went to that site and downloaded the zip file on a safe system, a pristine system. And when she did, she took that file and found that it actually downloads a zip file. And so she opened it up and she executed it in a sandbox, which is a really common tool for investigations. So she opened it up, she escalated it, she put it in a sandbox, and she found nothing happened. So she submitted the sample to VirusTotal, and VirusTotal said most antivirus systems knew nothing about it. It was considered, normal. So only 9 of 57 actually understood it to be malicious. So she said something's weird here, so she escalated it to an investigator, someone who's much more senior, who has more experience. The investigator now took this and ran it in 2 more sandboxes, right? Because you got JoeBox and Cuckoo, and we have other commercial tools at our disposal. So he ran it in a couple more, and it just sat there. Nothing happened. 30 minutes went by, nothing. Just timed out. So he said, you know what, something's weird. So he ran this on a physical system where he could do memory capture, just a debugger, right? You can look at the file system, memory, processes, and all that kind of stuff. And what he found was that within the code, it's just on a sleep timer. Just keep sleeping and waiting and sleeping and waiting. And so we knew that it was actually, it could detect whether it was running in a sandbox and would just sleep the whole time. So he dug into this a little further. He found that the malware, the first thing it did is it looked up using ipify.org to figure out the IP address of the victim. Now, this is kind of interesting because we're seeing more and more that malware is figuring out what country it's running in, what corporate network it's running in, and it may decide not to actually execute if it's on a system where it thinks a security researcher is evaluating it, right? Because of the country, the corporate IP address, the timing even. And so, it's actually pretty interesting. But then he saw it's using a Tor service tor2web.ru and .org to actually get the DGA needed, or to get the IP address needed to actually do the command and control. So the investigator took those IP addresses returned from those within the code, and he looked through all the Netflow, meaning all the network telemetry coming in and out. Nothing. There was no indication of a compromise. So the investigator raised a case to the customer. And what he said was, this is serious. This is malware designed to compromise your systems, but it's not yet confirmed. I have no indications that your systems are breached. So here's what you should do. Block the file hash, block these IP addresses, these domain names, okay? And the customer did that, and there was no further signs. So the only thing that happened is the malware was delivered, no indication that the malware was successful in actually breaching that system and exfiltrating data. So that's a sort of a happy ending, the rare happy ending of a security case. But what do we learn from that? We know that with attacks like this, that attackers are targeting corporate users. It's not just about your banking information anymore. So the attackers are after that. Second, we learned that attackers are getting better at evading sandboxes. They're figuring out how to write malware that can detect sandbox that it's running in it and then evade it. We also learned that Tor here is being used for command and control. A lot of corporate networks still allow Tor, but we're increasingly seeing it used for command and control. CryptoWall is a good example. And then lastly, we were able to block these, which means we'll help the customer move down to the left on that kill chain. So let me take you through a second example. This one is a little more sketchy. So VPN, if you have VPN back into the United States, it's a great way to watch Netflix, right? Great way to be able to watch stuff that, for whatever reason, they want to block you from otherwise. So we may see people using VPN for reasons other than just corporate IT. We also know that people use Tor for legitimate reasons in certain countries to get around firewall restrictions that country may impose due to totalitarian politics. They may use Tor as a way to get out to social media that they're starved from, right? So it can be a legitimate thing. And at one of our US customers, we found someone hitting a Tor exit node, okay? So this is one of the alerts that our our analyst found. So the analyst sees this user hitting a Tor exit node, and when she looked at the site, she also found a second alert that the site to which the user was connecting, the victim, well, in this case, it's not a victim, and I'll show you why, but the user was signed by Internet Widgets PTY, which is actually attributed to certain types of malware that uses this certificate signing authority. So, hey, you know what? This looks kind of weird. So she sent this case up to the investigator. The investigator now looked through the traffic and found VPN traffic going out through that Tor exit node. And we can actually see, if you look inside of here, that it's using something called private internet access. That's the name of the software. So the investigator now takes that case and rewinds the tape and sees that going back several weeks, there's Netflow indicating this person, this user, is VPNing out of the corporate network using Tor exit nodes to route traffic. Okay, so something looks kind of strange. Now, as I said earlier, VPN and Tor can be benign because it can be someone who's sort of a security zealot like most of us, who doesn't want anyone looking at our traffic, including the corporate IT department. It may be someone in an authoritarian country, but it can also be someone who's searching for illegal drugs, a hitman on Silk Road, or whatever has replaced Silk Road, right? So on a corporate network, these things are kind of fishy. So we raised the case to the customer. And again, this is a low priority case. We said to the customer, hey, this is potentially malicious traffic. You may have an insider who's taking data and exfiltrating it out of the network. We don't believe it's malware. We believe it's deliberate human activity. So the employee was interviewed. They asked him to remove the software, and that was the end of the story. What would you have done? In my case, as a security investigator, I would have done two things. First, I would have looked inside the network to see if this employee was accessing sensitive resources within the enterprise. The second thing I would have done is I would have done disk forensics on his system to see where else he's gone. And it may have resulted in a dismissal. But these are the kinds of things that we see on networks that require some, it requires some thought. You have to really think about it. It's not as simple as squashing a bug or squashing a virus. Now, let's do one more case. This one, I enjoy this case. You may be familiar with a piece of malware called China Chopper. And China Chopper is really cool because one of the capabilities it gives you is if you can successfully compromise the server, this is something you would typically use to breach a server. If you can successfully compromise a server, it gives you a virtual terminal. You can do database management. You can do file system management. You can do command line access. I mean, it's like you're right on the system. It's really a cool tool. And so we detected activity on this customer server. And by the way, this customer is a healthcare customer. And this same healthcare sector has been targeted by this Chinese actor called Dynamite Panda for years. So we know that this is a legitimate concern. Now, by the way, some of you may have seen this. A lot of companies, and I really cringe when I hear this, as soon as they see traffic to China or Iran or places like that, they want to shut it down. I say, come on. You may have customers there. You may have people who are interested in your company there. Just because it's attributed with that country doesn't mean it's malicious. In this case, it does. Because we know that this particular malware is used by a Chinese actor. This Chinese actor is specifically after information in the healthcare sector, and so it raises the alarm. So our analyst sees this and verifies the alert. Now, the analyst looked deeper into the alert and sees that this is indicative that what's happening is in the user file /file sm.cer, which is sort of deep in the bowels of the system. Definitely not something we should see someone accessing from the internet onto a web server, okay? This kind of activity should be done by an admin from inside the network, not outside the network. So she raises the escalation to an investigator. The investigator now, here's what happens. Investigator says, hey, this is clearly an indication that your system customer is being remotely controlled by an attacker known to be an APT actor, a nation state who's compromised your system. So we raise a high priority case, and I wonder if any of you have ever seen this happen before. We told the customer this is a serious case. You need to take the system offline, fully reimage it, patch it before you bring it back online. The customer ran antivirus, said it didn't find anything, and closed the case. Okay? We said, no, not so fast. There's something wrong. We want you to take another look. And what our investigator found, and this is one of the beautiful things about full packet capture, the investigator found that the attacker was live on the system, a live human attacker. Why? How do we know it's a human? Because they're making mistakes. They typed command.exe. The system said, I can't find that file. And then he corrected it to command.exe. So here we have evidence of a live human attacker on the system. We gave that evidence back to the customer. And when we did, the customer said, okay. They took the system offline. They rebuilt the system. They patched the system. They brought it online. And after that, we kept monitoring, and the system kept getting attacked. But the attack wasn't successful. So we were able to say, hey, good news, this thing is done. So it's fun to tell stories. These are 3 things that our staff and investigators do. And the last thing I want to say as I close out this discussion today is that our service began in the United States. I am in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's a beautiful place. We also have staff in Austin, Texas. We have a site in Sydney, Australia. And I'm really pleased to tell you that over the next few months, we will complete a huge security operations center, beautiful, state-of-the-art, right here in Krakow. And we'll be hiring staff here in Krakow, and for the specific purpose of serving customers in Europe, seated right here in Krakow at our beautiful facility here at Cisco. And that's really why I wanted to come today, is to begin this process of introducing you, making sure you know Cisco is a security company. We hire elite security investigators to help use these kinds of tools to help customers find these attacks. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope this has been useful as a way of seeing the tools in action and the kinds of work that a security investigator does. And I want to thank you for the time today. In order to respect the person asking a question, may I just ask for you to take conversation outside to make it easy for them to hear the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Hi, my name is Vladimir. I work for HP Security. You said that they reimaged the system completely. Were you able to understand what was the initial reason that got them hacked? Like, was there a vulnerability in software they used? Because if they reimage it one-to-one, like the same versions of all the softwares, they opened up the same hole by that, and the attacker succeeds again. So what did they do right that time?
Okay, great question. And so to restate the question, it is, okay, great. So you found the attack, you told the customer to fix it, they reimaged the system, patched it, and brought it online. But you're correct to observe that we also understood the way the attack succeeded. In other words, what's the vulnerability that allowed it? And it was something in PHP. They had like an out-of-date PHP module. And we guided them to make sure that was patched before they brought it online. So yes, we did. Yeah, great question.
Hi there. My name's Jeff from the University of Michigan. I have a question about case one. Could you tell me the duration between the detection to the analysis to contacting the customer? How long did that take?
So Jeff, your question on case one, I think that was the case of the corporate volume license Trojan, the one that it was like a Microsoft email.
Right.
Right. So Jeff's looking for a timeline here. My son is in Michigan, so I smiled at you because I have some affection for Michigan. What's the timeline? I, off the top of my head, well, actually, let me tell you this. We're doing full packet capture, which is extraordinarily useful in our investigations. But it also means you have to be relatively fast because, after 3 days, it's gone. I mean, you can only really hold it for so long. We have staff that works 24/7. So this initial detection and that sort of correlation to knowing this was malicious happened within a few hours. And we then escalated to the customer within just a few hours. So, and the reason I'm confident in that are twofold. One, we have to be that fast because of full packet capture. We can be that fast because of 24/7. And we were able to observe that the attack didn't succeed in actually making any further progress to seeing exfiltration. We only saw indications of the malware being downloaded. So just a few hours such that the customer was responsive enough to put those blocks, that mitigation in place. Okay, thank you. Questions? Don't be shy. Another one here, Vlad?
Hi again. Do you employ penetration testers to actually test how well you react to actual attacks, to simulate an actual attack?
So the question is, do we employ penetration testers to test ourselves? And that's a really good question, but we don't. I mean, I really should tell you we do because it makes it sound so much better, right? They're like, we're so elite, even the best penetration testers don't get past us. But there's a couple of reasons, right? Number one, customers are still kind of hinky about penetration testing. Like, for example, when we first started an engagement, we run vulnerability scans on the network looking for, where are you vulnerable so we can help you prioritize this. And they get kind of hinky about that. Because even, as you probably know, even scanning can knock over systems. And so customers will actually give us their vulnerability scanning information so we can use it. They sometimes let us do it, and they're getting a little better with it. And I think you're right that we will come to a place here where customers will say, well, look, if you're so great, let me run my penetration testing, and you guys tell me what you found. On my old team in Cisco CCERT, this happened all the time. Someone would run a pen test, they wouldn't tell us about it, we would catch them, and we would, hey, what are you guys doing? and it always felt great. But in my current team, that's not happening yet, and I think it's largely because customers are still kind of, the kinds of customers that are really helped by us, they're not super mature yet at security. So as they gain more maturity and confidence, I'm sure that they will use penetration testers to test my team's effectiveness. Okay? More questions?
What about dealing with command and control centers? So if you detect that there is some distributed malware, that there is botnets controlled by someone somewhere, so as I understand, you just inform a customer, you raise an incident, and then you just fix it, but not fix the not deal with a whole malicious network. So what are you doing to improve the internet from your Cisco way?
So I think you're saying, okay, fine, you find command and control, you inform the customer, you get it cleaned up, but what are you doing to help address the, I think you're
other cases.
Address the rest of the internet? Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. I would say that if you look at Cisco Talos, which is our intelligence group, and they're the ones that are finding malware, they're the ones that, there's a couple of things we do. One is we blog, right? So we can share with customers, I blogged about this case. Hey, here's what we're seeing, here's the attacks and the way they're working. We also have intelligence sharing that goes out. Shadow server, that's us, right? That's inside of Cisco. So we do a number of things to help share intelligence out, both in open source with the ISACs and trusted partners, et cetera. But we're not doing things like takedowns, right? We're not doing that kind of stuff. We're not involved. We cooperate in takedowns where it's useful, but it's not a first priority for us, right? The first priority is to help defend the victims. So good question, and I hope I answered honestly. It may not be satisfying, but that's really how we do it.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick remark. One of the reasons, of course, why... my name is Snoopy. I'm an external consultant working in the IT security area. And I have a large corporate customer, and what we're seeing is that they have a huge WAF infrastructure, and a lot of the attackers try to find out the real physical IP addresses to just bypass the WAF. That's a very common way of then gaining access, because very often WAFs are malconfigured and they will not block on physical IPs. They will just re-vector the domain name. And once you have the real IP, you're past it.
So interesting. So your observation is that WAF is great, but customers attackers will just essentially use the IP address and no DNS lookup is needed, which means it can get right through that stuff. Now, by the way, my team has a hunting playbook, so there are specific hunts that our investigators will run through data. And one of the hunts they employ is looking for a connection out to a set without a requisite DNS lookup, which would help us discover that kind of activity. But it's interesting, there are certain techniques that attackers will use where it's relatively easy to get past software defenses and hardware defenses, where our investigators can use their heads to look for that kind of stuff. So great remark, and I would agree. More questions and comments? Okay, I think we should end here. Thank you for your questions. I'd be very happy to talk with you afterwards. And thanks for the invitation to come. I'm really glad to support this conference and glad to see such a great turnout here. Thank you again.